All right. Geography 101, Chapter 15, and this is part 5, and this should be the last part, I hope. We'll end with talking about the geography of elections. So remember, one of the ways a government maintains legitimacy is by elections, by giving the people political power. So if you have the power to change the government by voting for the leadership, you have a greater buy-in. So that is a way that a government can maintain its legitimacy. But how the votes are distributed can affect that. So you can have different level of votes at a national or regional basis. So in Nigeria, for instance, there's many different cultural groups, and overall, you look at this map right here. This area in green was the winner. This person had 50, almost 60% of the vote. This person had about 30% of the vote, and this person a very small percentage. Now, if you looked at this as a map, you'd see the country is evenly split, right? And in area, it is. But when it comes to people, the southern half is much more densely populated. So if you looked at just the pure numbers, you'd see a landslide, 60% to 30%, and you wouldn't see this pattern. But this reflects deeper divisions within Nigeria. In Nigeria, the northern half of the country is far more rural. This is like the countryside, if you will. It's also much more highly Muslim, whereas the south has some of the largest cities. Lagos, right here, is one of the largest cities in the world, and several large cities. So it's a very urban population, and also much more Christian. So you kind of see the patterns here. Another thing we often see is the neighborhood effect, and what that says is if somebody from this area of the country moves to one of these areas here, they'll tend to start voting for the green candidate over time. They'll make that switch. Okay. You can make the example somebody who votes Democrat moves to a Republican state has a higher chance of in a sense turning Republican in future elections. And what you often see in these geographies of elections is the idea of polarization, right? So within this country, basically people tended to vote for one of two parties. There are more than one. There's more than two, but they basically split this way. And you see this polarization or the kind of the gap between people who vote here and very few in the middle. And a good example is the US. So this is the map right here. Now, Hillary Clinton in 2016 had more people voting for her than Donald Trump, but she was not elected president. As we talked about, when you look at the number of states that she won fewer states. So these are counties, these blue dots. The ones that are blue are the counties that voted for Hillary Clinton. And if you look at this map, it looks like hardly anybody voted for her. Large areas are not. They're voted for Trump. But I will tell you this. This is Los Angeles County. This county right here, Los Angeles County, has more people than, we'll say, Montana, North and South Dakota, Wyoming, and Nebraska. So one county has more than 5 states. Cook County, New York City, those 3 counties have more population than half the states. So in reality, she won the popular vote, but because the way it was divided, it was very different. And one of the things that's interesting, we look right here. These are the red counties. These are the counties that voted for Barack Obama, and in the next election voted for Trump. So basically, they flipped from a Democratic candidate to president to Republican. And this is the difference in the election. So this swath right here and right here, this is the reason that Donald Trump was elected. And so the geography of that affects that very much. More people voted for his opponent, but because of the way they fall in the states, Donald Trump won the state of Wisconsin, which was one of the votes that he actually had more states with. And so this goes to the geography of representation. In other words, how do we draw these boundaries, right? Why do we have these boundaries that don't accurately represent people? We call these constituencies, by the way. If you are a congressman from Illinois, Illinois has 9 congresspeople in Congress and 2 senators. Now, who you vote for your congressman, for your representative, depends on where you live. So if you live on the north side of Chicago, you vote for one person. If you live on the south side or if you live in Springfield, Illinois, you vote for someone else. That's the constituency. Okay. Same thing for city council, right? If you live in one ward, you vote for somebody, and then if you live in another ward, you vote for someone else. Now, how you draw these lines can be done to favor people unfairly. That's malapportionment. And this is often done to maintain political power. So here's an example. This area in blue right here, this outlined area in blue, this is the 4th congressional district. So the people that live within this kind of weird earmuff shaped district vote for a certain congressman, right? So think about that. People who live here or here vote for someone else. Why is it drawn this way? They call this gerrymandering, by the way. When you draw these boundaries, that's because this district was drawn up to have a majority Hispanic population. So here is Little Village in Pilsen, Berwyn and Cicero, and then up here on the far northwest side. So within this area, the majority of voters are Hispanic. And this was drawn up this way so that the people who are Hispanic would have the ability to elect a Hispanic congressman. That's actually legal. You can do that. And we have many congressional districts drawn that way. The problem is, what about if we drew it to exclude Republicans so that people who are Republican in this area really don't have a chance to win? And that's a big controversy right now. You know, a lot of congressional districts are drawn this way. Every year, in the last, I believe it's 4 elections, if you count the total number of votes for congressmen and senators across the entire country, 60% of the votes are for Democratic candidates. But yet, Democrats have been a minority in Congress for most of this time. And it's how these districts are drawn. And the reason they're drawn that way is every 10 years they redraw them. And if the Democratic Party is in power on that date in 2000, then they will draw borders that benefit them. And if the Republicans are in power, they tend to draw boundaries that are inherently favorable to them. There's actually a case before the Supreme Court on this. Can you do that? Can you draw districts to favor a political party? And it's not quite clear how they're going to come down on that. And that also goes to the electoral system. How do you actually count the votes? Every vote gets counted. But in our country, we have a first past the post. So, in other words, if you have this district, the person who wins is the person who gets the most votes. Plain and simple. That's not always the case. What if we looked at the state of Illinois as a whole, instead of having these districts, and you voted for people? And if the Democratic Party got 65% of the vote, they would get 65% of the congressmen from Illinois. Some countries do that. We have a kind of interesting thing in Chicago, right? We have the mayoral election every year. And think about the last mayoral election when Lori Lightfoot was running for mayor. We have the election for mayor, the primary, and anybody can file and run. If nobody gets more than half of the total votes cast, so if nobody gets 49 or 50% or better, then we take the top 2 vote getters and we have another election. So that's exactly what happened. In the first round, Lori Lightfoot and Toni Preckwinkle got the most votes, but nobody got more than 50%. There are, I believe, 9 people running for mayor. And we took those top 2, Lori Lightfoot and Toni Preckwinkle, and we had another round of elections, and Lori Lightfoot won. One way to look at that, what if we had ranked voting? So you had 9 candidates running for mayor, but only 2 could go on to the next level. What if you voted for your first choice, your second choice, your third choice? And the way they do that is they have an election, and you rank there's 5 people running, and you rank them 1 to 5 on who you want. If nobody gets more than half the votes, the bottom number 5 person is tossed out, and now you have 4. And ranked voting allows you to do that because maybe sometimes you aren't necessarily for one or the other. So there's many different ways of how you count the votes available. So when we look at all this, we look at the relationship between states, empires, countries, the relations that are legal and political, not cultural. They call that geopolitics, the idea of world geography, strategic world geography. Okay, so why do we have beneficial or we have good relationships with, say, United Kingdom and France, but not with Syria, not with Russia. The strategy of it, right? Now, a critical way or questioning look says we question this. In other words, do we identify more with countries because of the way we identify, right? In other words, we identify more with European countries because we share a common cultural heritage, maybe, and less with Asian countries. That would be a critical look at that. Okay. Another aspect would see that there are material interests involved. So, for instance, in the Middle East, we have a very strong relationship with Saudi Arabia and a very weak relationship with Iran. Both are run by governments that are not the most democratic. In fact, Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy. There's no democratic politics at all. But we also are a large business partner with Saudi Arabia. We do a lot of trade, and we don't with Iran. So that affects our geopolitics. Okay. And then the popular culture. How does mass media affect this? Back in the day when I was in high school, back in the 1800s, right now, when I was in high school and you saw a movie and there was a bad guy or a villain, he was usually Russian. Back then, though, you called him Soviet because the Russians, the Soviets, the communists were our enemies, right? And you'd see this with mass media or movies, and also in our geopolitics. But after 1992, when the Soviet Union dissolved and became Russia, all of a sudden Russians were our friends. They were trying to be, democratic country, and you didn't see Russian bad guys anymore. But what did you see? You saw Korean bad guys, so specifically North Korean bad guys or Syrian. You started seeing more Arab bad guys. And at the same time, you see our relationship with a lot of Arab countries decline, right? So how that is designed or what that means, that is one of the ideas that geopolitics explores. Why do we have these relationships? What's the cultural aspect behind it? How are they maintained? So we've made it to the end of this chapter. Great little summary notes here. Thank you all for listening, and have a good afternoon, good evening, good night.